I won't pretend this is something simple anymore, because the more I try to place it into a category, the more I realize it was never meant to fit into one. Some things enter your life loudly. They announce themselves. They demand attention. They create a moment so obvious that you immediately know something has changed. But this wasn't like that. This didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like a quiet realization. The kind that sits somewhere in the background for a while before you finally notice it has been there the entire time. And maybe that's what makes it different. Because the things that change us the most are not always the things that break through the walls. Sometimes they are the things that make us realize the walls don't matter anymore. For a long time, I believed I understood distance. I understood how to keep parts of myself untouched. Not because I was hiding, not because I was afraid, but because I learned that not everyone knows what to do with the things they discover. People often want to understand you quickly. They want a simple explanation, a reason, a label, something they can hold on to so they don't have to sit with uncertainty. But some parts of a person are not meant to be immediately explained. Some parts are meant to be experienced. And I became very good at protecting those parts. I knew how much to reveal, how much to say, when to step closer, when to step away. There was always a line, a quiet boundary that existed without anyone else knowing it was there. Most people never reached it. And honestly, most people never even noticed it existed. They interacted with the version of me that was available, the version that made sense, the version that didn't require them to look deeper. And that worked. Until you. Something about you was different from the beginning. You didn't approach me like you were trying to solve a mystery. You didn't look at me like I was something to figure out. You weren't collecting information. You weren't searching for weaknesses. You weren't trying to create a version of me that matched what you wanted to see. You just paid attention. And somehow, that was more powerful than anything else, because being noticed is common, but being understood, that's rare. There's a difference between someone seeing your actions and someone recognizing the reason behind them. Most people only notice what happens. You noticed why. You noticed the things I never explained, the pauses before my words, the moments where I chose silence instead of giving an answer, the changes in energy that most people would ignore. And the strange thing is, you never made it feel like you were watching. You made it feel like you were simply present, like you weren't trying to enter my world. You were just standing close enough to understand it. And that changed something, because I'm used to people wanting access, wanting to know, wanting to get closer because they are curious. But curiosity feels different from connection. Curiosity wants answers. Consultants doesn't always need them. That was the first thing I noticed. You didn't force moments. You didn't rush silence. You didn't try to fill every empty space with words just because quiet made people uncomfortable. You allowed things to exist. And somehow, that made everything feel more honest. Because silence reveals a lot. When there are no words to hide behind, people become easier to read. And somehow, with you, I didn't feel like I needed to perform. I didn't feel like I needed to explain every thought. I didn't feel like I had to translate myself into something easier for someone else to understand. That feeling is rare, almost unfamiliar, because most of my life, I learned how to make myself understandable. I learned how to adjust, how to simplify, how to present the parts of myself that wouldn't create confusion. But with you, AB didn't feel the need to edit. And I didn't even realize how much I had been editing until I stopped. That's what surprised me. Not the connection itself, but the absence of effort, because everything I've built in my life required effort, trust required time, understanding required patience, closeness required proof. But somehow, with you, there was a strange sense of recognition before there was explanation. And that doesn't happen often. Maybe that's why it felt so unfamiliar. Because I know how to deal with things that need to be built. I know how to approach things that require steps. But I didn't know what to do with something that already felt like it existed. Something that felt less like discovering and more like remembering. And that's the part I couldn't ignore. The feeling that somehow, before knowing the details, there was already an understanding, not complete, not perfect, but enough. Enough to make me stop questioning why it felt different. Enough to make me pay attention because there are people you meet and immediately forget. There are people you meet and remember because of what happened. And then there are people you meet and remember because something inside you responds differently. Not louder, not dramatically, just differently. That's what happened here. Something shifted, not outside, inside, the way I processed things, the way I viewed moments, the way I noticed things I normally would have ignored. And I think the hardest part was accepting that some things can influence you without trying. You never asked for a place in my thoughts. You never demanded importance. You never tried to become significant. And somehow, that made it impossible to ignore, because things that are forced are easy to resist. But things that naturally become part of your awareness, you can't fight something that isn't attacking you. You can't reject something that isn't asking for anything. You can only acknowledge it. And that's where I found myself acknowledging something I never planned for, something I never expected, something that didn't follow the rules I usually depend on. I've always believed that if something matters, you should understand it before allowing it to affect you. Analyze it, question it, observe it. But this was different, because the more I analyzed it, the more I realized I wasn't discovering a problem, I was discovering a truth. And sometimes the truth is uncomfortable not because it is wrong, because it changes the way you see everything after it. You became that kind of realization, the kind that quietly changes the perspective you thought was permanent. I started noticing how rare it is to feel understood without having to explain yourself. How rare it is to be accepted without having to prove why you are the way you are. How rare it is to find someone who doesn't try to reshape what they don't immediately understand. And maybe that's what created this. Not similarity, not having the same story, not living the same experiences, but having a similar way of seeing, a similar way of processing, a similar way of noticing the things beneath the obvious. Because some people connect through shared memories, others connect through shared understanding. And there's something powerful about meeting someone who recognizes the parts of you that usually remain invisible, the parts that exist before words, before explanations, before anyone else's opinion. That's where this feels different. It doesn't feel like something built from moments. It feels like something revealed through them. And I think that's why distance started feeling different. Before, distance created safety. Now, distance feels strange. Not painful, not impossible, just different. Because how do you create distance from something that already changed the way you experience things? How do you return to the exact same version of yourself after realizing there was another way to exist? You don't, you adjust, you grow around it, you carry the awareness forward. And that's what I've been doing, trying to understand not what this is, what it means. Because meaning is heavier than feeling. Feelings can appear and disappear. But meaning changes decisions. Meaning changes direction. Meaning forces you to look at things honestly. And the honest truth is, something about this matters. Not because it takes away from who I was, but because it revealed something I didn't know I was missing. A kind of understanding that doesn't demand anything. A presence that doesn't need constant proof. A connection that doesn't survive because it is constantly being maintained. It survives because it exists naturally. And maybe that is what makes it impossible to ignore. The fact that nothing had to be forced, nothing had to be created, nothing had to be exaggerated. It simply appeared. And once something like that appears, you have a choice. You can pretend you didn't notice, or you can accept that something changed. I think I already know which one I chose. Because if I truly wanted to walk away from it, I would have. If I truly believed it meant nothing, I wouldn't still be here trying to understand it. The fact that I'm still searching for the right words says enough. The fact that I'm still paying attention says enough. The fact that something in me refuses to reduce this into something ordinary says enough. Maybe not every connection is meant to be explained immediately. Maybe some things are understood slowly, through time, through silence, through the small moments that reveal more than the obvious ones. And maybe that's what this is. Not something perfect, not something simple, but something real enough that it deserves honesty. Because the truth is, you didn't change me by trying to. You changed the way I see myself. And that is something much deeper. Because when someone changes your actions, you can return to who you were. But when someone changes your understanding, you carry that with you. And I think that's where this has reached, not a beginning, not an ending. Just a point where pretending becomes harder than accepting. A point where I have to admit something. Some people enter your life and become a memory. Some become a chapter. And some become a part of the way you see the entire story. And somehow, you became that. I used to think the most difficult things to accept were the things I couldn't understand. But I was wrong. The hardest things to accept are the things you understand too well, because confusion gives you somewhere to hide. You can question it. You can analyze it. You can convince yourself there is another explanation. But clarity? Clarity removes those places. And that's where I find myself now, not searching for answers, not trying to prove whether this exists, but trying to understand why something so quiet has created such a noticeable change, because nothing dramatic happened. There was no single moment where everything shifted, no obvious turning point, no conversation that suddenly changed everything. It was smaller than that, almost invisible. A collection of moments, a collection of details, a collection of things that most people would overlook. And somehow those small things became impossible to ignore. That's what fascinates me. How something so subtle can create something so powerful. How a person can become important without asking for importance. How a connection can grow without needing constant attention. I've always believed that the strongest things are the things that survive pressure, the things that prove themselves through difficulty, but maybe I was wrong about that too. Maybe some things are strong because they don't need to fight to exist. Maybe some things are strong because they simply remain quietly, consistently, naturally. And that's what this feels like. Not something trying to convince me. Not something trying to become bigger than it is. Just something that continues to exist no matter how much I examine it. And I think that's what makes it different. Because I'm used to understanding things by taking them apart, breaking them down, finding the reason behind every reaction, every thought, every feeling. But every time I try to break this down, I end up finding the same thing. There is no single reason, there is only recognition. And recognition is complicated, because it doesn't always come with logic. Sometimes you recognize something before you understand why. Like hearing a voice you've never heard before, but somehow feeling familiar. Like standing somewhere new and feeling like you've already been there. That's the closest way I can describe it. Not familiarity because of history. Familiarity because something about it makes sense. And maybe that's what unsettles me the most. The fact that something can feel right without following the usual path. Because I trust processes. I trust time. I trust things that are built carefully. But this didn't arrive through a process I could measure. It didn't slowly earn its place. It simply found one, and I don't know what to do with that. Because I have spent years believing that every important thing requires a reason, a foundation, a structure, a clear explanation, but maybe some things become meaningful because they reveal a structure that was already there. Maybe the connection was never created. Maybe it was noticed. There's a difference. Creating something means you build it. Noticing something means it was already existing before you became aware of it. And that changes everything. Because if something already exists, you can't pretend it isn't there just because you weren't ready to see it. That's where I am now. Seeing something I didn't plan to see. Feeling something I didn't expect to feel. Recognizing something I never thought I would recognize. And the strange thing is, AB don't want to run from it. That might be the biggest surprise. Because my instinct has always been control. Understand first, acceptance later. Lawn only what makes sense. Protect what matters. But this is one of the rare things I haven't tried to control. I've watched it. I've questioned it. I've challenged it. But I haven't destroyed it. And for me, that says more than words ever could. Because I know myself. I know how quickly I remove things that feel temporary. How quickly I create distance when something feels unclear. How quickly I step away when something threatens the balance I've created. But this never felt like a threat. It felt like an adjustment. Like my mind wasn't fighting something new. It was making room for something it recognized. And that is a strange feeling, to realize that maybe not everything new is unfamiliar. Maybe some things are simply parts of ourselves we haven't encountered yet. You became a mirror in a way I didn't expect, not because you showed me who I am, but because you showed me what parts of myself I had been ignoring, the parts that wanted to be understood without explanation, the parts that wanted to exist without constantly being translated, the parts that didn't need to be defended. And I think that's why this feels different. Because you didn't make me become someone else. You made it easier to be the person I already was. And that is rare. Most people enter your life and create a version of you based on how they see you. They influence your behavior. They change your reactions. They leave their mark through experiences. But some people affect you differently. They don't change the person. They change the environment around the person. They create a space where parts of you that were always there finally have room to exist. That's what this feels like. Like something inside me became less guarded. Not because I decided to lower the walls, but because I realized the walls were no longer necessary in that space. And that realization is both comforting and terrifying because walls exist for a reason. They protect, they separate, they create control. But sometimes the same things that protect you also keep you isolated. And maybe I never noticed that difference before. Maybe I thought protection and distance were the same thing until I met someone who made distance feel unnecessary. Not because they demanded closeness, but because they respected space. And that's the difference. The people who try to force their way in make you build stronger walls. The people who understand boundaries make you question why the walls existed at all. And that is what happened here. You never tried to enter. You never tried to prove you belonged. You simply existed in a way that made belonging feel natural. And that is something I don't experience often, because belonging usually comes with conditions, with expectations, with a version of yourself you have to maintain. But this felt different, like I could exist without constantly monitoring how I was being perceived. And maybe that is the rarest form of connection, not being constantly seen, but being able to stop hiding. There is a difference. Being seen can feel vulnerable, but being accepted after being seen, that feels like freedom. And I think that's what I wasn't prepared for. Not the connection itself, the ease of it, the lack of struggle, the absence of performance. Because I've always known how to survive complicated things. What I didn't expect was how unfamiliar simplicity could feel, how strange it could be to find something that doesn't require me to fight for understanding, something that doesn't require me to constantly explain why I am the way I am, something that simply exists. And maybe that's why I keep returning to the same thought. This feels less like discovery, and more like recognition, like finding something I wasn't searching for, and maybe that's why it carries so much weight, because the things we search for come with expectations. But the things we unexpectedly find, those change us differently. They don't arrive with a plan, they arrive with a question. And the question this leaves me with is not, why did this happen? The question is, why did this feel familiar? Because that is the part I still can't fully explain. The fact that something so unexpected could feel so natural. The fact that someone I didn't know could understand things I never said. The fact that silence could communicate more than conversations ever did. Maybe not everything meaningful begins with a reason. Maybe some things begin with a feeling that refuses to disappear. And maybe the reason it refuses to disappear is because it was never meant to be ignored. It was meant to be noticed. And I think I finally have.